Continuing our reading in Abraham Hannibal and the Battle for the Throne by Francis Summers Cox, Chapter 10, The Journey to Moscow, and the date is August 1706 to January 1707. Nearly 6 months it took to reach Tsar Peter. Oh, Abraham was so tired of traveling. After the humdrum quiet of 2 whole years in the Sultan's palace, when he never stirred outside its walls, never went anywhere, and life was peaceful, suddenly dreadful memories of all those weary, dangerous journeys long ago, through the desert and across rough seas, began to flood his mind, and even to fill his dreams. And this journey was the worst of all. How often he wished that he had stayed gardening with Uncle Mustafa. Peter Tolstoy had handed him and 2 other slave boys, just normal black slaves from the slave market, not from the Sultan's palace, once over to a fat merchant with the jaw-breaking name of Sava Vladislavich Ragozinski. Not that any of the boys could manage a name like that. They called him Sir to his face, and Sava, or Fatty Sava, behind his back. Fatty Sava was traveling all the way to Moscow, King Peter's ancient capital, and taking the 3 boys along with his normal cargo of cotton and olive oil. It was to Fatty Sava's ship that the boatman took Abraham that dark night when the white slave guards went on the rampage. And it was in Fatty Sava's ship that Abraham began that terrible journey. First, there was the sea, the stormy narrow passage north from Istanbul, where you sail with the dark cliffs of Europe to your left and the dark cliffs of Asia to your right, gloomy castles towering high above, guarding the way. It would be easy enough on a dark and wild night to believe the sailors who, in days of old, told tales of those cliffs clanging shut and grinding together, crushing the little ships that tried to sail through. Then at last you sail out into the stormy, foggy wastes of the Black Sea, a sea so wild and savage that in the olden days sailors called it the Friendly Sea, to try and fool it into being kind. Time and time again in those storms Abraham thought he was going to die, and he and the other 2 black slaves, Isa and Seki, huddled together down in the hold, praying that it would all be over quickly. And waking and sleeping, Abraham's mind was filled with dreams, memories, and questions. Drum, 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 drum. What has become of them all in the burning city? Oh God, look, there is Lahia sinking down under the waves of the Red Sea. Am I going to drown like her? No, no, please God, no. At long last, they reached the tall city walls and towers of Azov in the south of Russia, that had once been the Sultan's but was now Russian, and they unloaded their cargo, some of it to sell to merchants there, and some to take to Moscow in flat-bottomed riverboats. Then came the long, slow haul up the great river Don, sailing with the wind when there was any, and when there was none, the boys helped to pull the boats against the strong current, struggling along the bank with their hearts pounding furiously, knees and shoulders and every joint aching, the rough tow ropes digging savagely into their chests, even through their clothes. On each side of the great river there was nothing but endless great grass fields, empty and wild, with the fear always of bandits, horsemen, galloping up to steal their goods and murder or enslave them all. The summer faded fast, and a chilly north wind began to blow, colder than anything Abraham had known. Even Fatty Sava's Russian sailors and workers began to feel it, and wrapped up warm on board, and when they were towing on the tow path. Then Abraham noticed something else begin to happen. Abraham and the other boys had never seen before. Stranger by far, a shining, hard, cold crust began to appear on the surface of the water, and in the morning the blades of grass were often white and stiff. One day, as the three boys were out helping to tow the boat upstream, their cheeks boiling hot and their breath panting painfully in thick white clouds, they saw their first snow. The little white flakes danced lazily down at first, just a few, but then started to fall thickly, and the hard ground was soon soft and white. The boys wanted to stop and feel it, shape it, and throw it, but they couldn't stop, couldn't let go of the tow ropes. But at least they could feel it cold on their hot faces, taste it cold and delicious on their tongues, and scrape and kick it with their feet. Fatty Sava, who was walking toward the towpath, not to help pull, but just to keep warm, came over to the boys. What do you think of our snow then, boys? First, you've seen it, I'll be bound. It'll get much worse. I can tell you that for free. A nice change from the jungle for you. The boys had picked up a little bit of Russian by now from the men working on the boats, but never enough to answer Sava back with what was on their minds. In any case, even Abraham wouldn't have dared. At the next little town, they left their boat, as the river was getting too full of ice to be safe. They rested a few days in a tiny, smelly inn full of fleas, and by that time the river was solid. The journey continued faster now, this time on horse-drawn sledges, racing along the smooth, icy surface of the river, their little bells tinkling. But oh, the dreadful cold. Pulling the boat was almost better, since at least they kept warm. But this way the icy wind pierced through the thick wool and fur they wore wrapped around themselves, and froze their feet in their boots and their fingers in their gloves. The Russians taught the boys, when their skin went gray and dead, white with frostbite, to rub it alive again, and the cold, prickly snow itself. It was all right for Fatty Sava. He traveled inside a comfortable closed sledge, snug and hot water bottles, candles, even books to read. But for the others on the open sledges, the cold was the sharpest pain that Abraham had ever known. And although he had no cloak, no clock, no real straw outer garments, Abraham slowly became aware of something weird and unsettling. Somehow, I can't think how, the nights are longer here than I've ever known them. There are fewer hours of light. I know there are. Oh God, I'm so far from home. I'm so far from everything that makes sense. How am I ever going to get to France? And there was always the fear of not reaching an inn before dark, before the horses wore out, when the only lights they could see were not the windows of friendly cottages, but the eyes of wolves glowing yellow through the shadows, waiting. One afternoon, their journey along the frozen River Don brought them to the strangest of places, a harbor frozen dead, where galleys and tall sailing ships loomed through the twilight, trapped in the thick ice, while others half-built lay like monstrous skeletons between giant sheds on the riverbanks. Tsar Peter's shipyards, explained Fatty Sava. First modern ships this country's ever had. All Tsar Peter's idea. They'll be downriver to the Black Sea in no time if the Sultan should give us any trouble again. They'll give him a scare he won't forget. It's not for nothing that people are starting to call our Tsar Peter, Peter the Great. New ideas and inventions, wherever you look. Beating his enemies to the north and south. Making Russia a force to be reckoned with. That's what we are now, a force to be reckoned with. Ha! And Fatty Sava stomped one huge furry boot hard into the snow, as if he was personally responsible for all of Russia's successes. The icy white days wore on, and Isa, the youngest of the three slave boys, grew sick of smallpox. They stopped for 2 whole weeks in a village, and Fatty Sava flapped endlessly around the poky, airless inn, chewing his nails. Tsar Peter asked for 3 black boys. I promised him 3 black boys. What if I lose one? What if I lose the lot? Oh, don't you dare die, you monkeys! Don't you dare die! Abraham began to get his drift. You brute! All you care about is keeping in with Tsar Peter. What about us? We're losing our friend. I'm losing another friend. And then, in that filthy inn, Issa, the youngest of the slave boys, died. But Seki and Abraham continued to live and journey north. The wide open grassland gave way now to thick forests, and at last they left their smooth, fast road, the frozen river, and the sledges skidded and bumped over the rougher ground, the snow-covered rocks and holes and bumps and dips of the so-called proper road, until they reached another river, and in a little village they celebrated Christmas, Abraham's first since he had left Ethiopia 3 years before. And a little later, Fatty Sava said, "Just one more day, boys. Just one more day. And then we're in Moscow." And that's the end of chapter 10.